All right, let's get right into it. We've got our first puzzle in this position, starting off with our rating of 1003, working our way up to 1200. Our opponent has just played the move king f3. They were responding to a check just a moment ago, so they had to move the king somewhere. They end up moving to a square where we can continue and follow up with another check in this position. Right now, the king only has two safe squares available. The king is on f3, and there is the g3 square that is also potentially available to move to. Here we can go ahead and deliver a check with the rook on the eighth, excuse me, the rook on the eighth rank going up to the e3 square. Moving up here does give us a check, and it is a checkmate at the same time since the bishop covers the g4 square. Okay, let's continue along. Let's go right to the next one. So here white has just played the move queen to e7. As always, we always begin by looking at our checks and captures first. We have two different checks, I guess three different checks technically. We can take f3, or sorry, take g1, take h4, or check on f3. And taking on h4 is going to be the best. Right now, the king only has two escape squares, or two safe squares available, h1 and h2. If we take on h4, it is a checkmate in one move in this position here. All right, so here black has just captured the pawn on the c2 square. Currently, we're down a piece. Black is not really threatening anything in this position, which is nice for us. That means we essentially have a free move to do whatever we would like to go for. And yeah, being down a piece, we definitely have to look for ways to at least equalize the material or win more material or deliver checkmate, which would be kind of the most ideal situation. So we don't really have any great checks to go for here. We probably aren't wanting to sacrifice the rook for the bishop and be down a full rook at that point without a very good follow-up, which I don't really see one. In terms of other captures, there's no other captures available. But there is this important pin on the back rank that our opponent is dealing with. And if we can pile up on the bishop on f8, which is the pinned piece, if we can add a second attacker to the bishop, then we're going to be in pretty good shape and probably be able to win the bishop. So we can actually attack this bishop two different ways. We can go to c5 or to h6. We're not going to want to go to c5 because the rook and the knight cover that square, but it is possible for us to play the move bishop to h6. And this ends up being the end of the puzzle because there's nothing that black can do to stop us from playing the move rook takes f8 with checkmate. They can throw in a check on c1 and, we can move the king away and then we're still going to deliver the checkmate. If they bring the rook back to c8, we'll just take the rook and black is still getting checkmated here no matter what. Okay, let's go to our next one. So black just moved their queen over to the a1 square. Again, we're looking for checks and captures to begin with. Checks first of all, specifically. We have the move bishop a6 check. We have queen e6 check. We have other checks that are available with the queen and the bishop, but they're not going to be safe to do. If you check here, you get captured by the pawn, and any of these other queen checks, you're going to get captured by the king or the rook. So bishop a6 check is the first move I would look at. Black really only has one move available in response. They'd have to play the move king to b8. And then we can follow up with another check. We can play the move queen to b7, delivering checkmate, because the bishop on a6 protects the queen on the b7 square. So we check, and then checkmate. All right, let's keep plugging along. So here, black has just made the move knight to e7, and ends up that we're the ones that are in check in this position. So we absolutely have to move the king. We have three different squares available for the king to move to. And I would, even though we have to move the king, we can still look for forcing moves at the same time. So if we move the king backwards down to the d4 or e4 squares, black essentially gets a free move because we're not putting any pressure on them. However, if we move the king up to the d6 square, we are attacking the rook and also putting pressure on the knight. The rook would have to move to the b7 square in order to keep the knight safe. And then I think after that, it looks like we can probably play the move rook to f7 in order to pin the knight. And then the knight is going to be captured because it has nowhere safe to move to. Actually, now that I'm saying that, actually the king here, rook here, there is the move. If we go rook f7, there is the move knight c8, which we would have to take into account. So with that in mind, it might actually be better when the rook's on b7. Yeah, we don't want to go rook e8 because the knight can retreat to g8. So I am leaning towards the answer being rook f7. Because after the knight goes to c8 to give the check, I think we still move the king over to attack the rook. And if the rook on b7 takes our rook on f7 and we take back with the pawn, the knight on c8 and the king 8 on h7, neither one of those can stop us from pushing the pawn up to f8 and promoting the pawn. Black could give another check on e7 when our king is on c6, but after the king moves, if the knight tries to go to g6 to cover f8, we've got the pawn covering the g6 square. So this one's a little convoluted, but I do believe we are moving up the board, pinning the knight. If the knight had given the check, we would have gone to c6. If the knight doesn't move, we're simply going to take the knight, and we are up. Well, we're not ahead of piece necessarily, but we are having equal amount of material on the board. The biggest advantage we have in this position is that we have this pawn on e6 that's very far up the board. It is a pass pawn, and we are most likely going to promote the pawn pretty soon from a position like this. Okay, let's go to our next one. So here Black just moved the rook over to the f8 square. So we first of all look for our own checks and captures. Queen takes d7 is the only check we really have available. It is safe to take that knight because our bishop would be protecting the queen when we do take the knight. The king would have to go to the b8 square. And then what additional checks or forcing moves do we have from there? It does end up that we can play the move queen to d6 check, attacking the king as well as the rook on f8. And once the king moves into the corner on the a8 square, which is the only safe move, then we can take the rook and deliver checkmate. So this one's just a series of checks. Check, check, and checkmate in this position. Okay, next one here. White just played the move rook to g1. I guess they are protecting the bishop a couple of extra times. So we have to figure out, okay, what checks and captures do we have to begin with here? Bishop takes g3 is really the only forcing move that I can see in this position that makes any sense. It's a check. We don't want to take with the queen and lose our queen. That doesn't seem to make a ton of sense. And the only other capture I see is to take on c1, but that would also lose the queen. So taking on g3 seems to be the first move that we should focus on. White has two main options in response. They can either take with the rook or take with the pawn. If they do take with the rook, it looks like we should be able to capture the rook on c1 for free because the rook on g1 would no longer be there protecting it. So the alternative option is for white to recapture with the pawn. However, when the pawn recaptures, it does open up a new checking opportunity that wasn't previously available. We can now play the move queen to d2 with check once the pawn on f2 is out of the way. We hit the king. We also attack the bishop on d3 at the same time. And there's no good way for white to block the check or defend against the check and save the bishop simultaneously. If the bishop goes and blocks the check, we can just take the bishop because it would be unprotected in that position. So it looks like we should take the bishop on g3 with check, check on d2, take the bishop. We are now ahead of piece, and things are looking pretty good for us. All right, next position. Here, Black just played the move queen to d7. In terms of checks, we have a couple of checks available, but also in terms of captures, as far as I can see, I think we just have a simple capture of the queen on d7. This queen is unprotected, nobody's defending it. If we take the queen, there's really no counterplay or checks or forcing moves that Black has. So the only thing that would be better than taking the queen would be if we could somehow deliver checkmate instead. But if we give either one of these checks, the king can just move away, and I don't see a follow-up really at that point. So I think we're just taking the queen, and that does end up being the answer here. Okay, next position. Black here just moved the king up to the c6 square. Again, what checks and captures do we have available? We have a check on e6, a check on c8, the check on c7. I think we just lose the rook, so that doesn't seem to make a ton of sense. So these are two different checks that are available. You would want to look at the check that gives the opponent the least amount of responses first. If we check on e6, the king has three different squares that it can move away to. And if we check on c8, the king only has one square available that it can move away to. So I would start by looking at c8 because it narrows the amount of options that the opponent has available. And after the king goes to b4, they are attacking the rook on e7. We would want to see, do we have any follow-up checks in that position? And we do have the move bishop to b4. Bishop to b4 hits the king on d6, but also aims through the king to protect the rook. And as far as I can tell, that looks like a checkmate. So rook to c8 check, bishop to b4. We do deliver the checkmate in this position here. Oops, clicked on the wrong thing. Okay, sorry. We'll have to repeat this one. Okay, so next position. White just played the move king to d2. I guess they were in check a moment ago. And again, we ask ourselves, what checks and captures do we have? I don't know how our king. I have no clue how our king ended up on d4. This looks like a very weird position. But in terms of checks, we have a couple of different queen checks. We have a bishop check. Right now, though, the queen is doing a good job. Excuse me. The queen is doing a good job of kind of restricting the king. So I wouldn't really be rushing to check with the queen because it's probably any of the queen checks we give, they're gonna allow an escape square from the opponent's king. I would try to involve a new piece in this type of position where the opponent has no safe moves available with their king. So I would actually look at bishop f4 check. First of all, the king has no safe squares available. The rook would have to block on e3. And then I think there we can take with the bishop or the queen. I think they're probably both going to result in checkmate. Maybe the simplest option is bishop takes with check, king e1, queen f2 check, king d1, queen f1 checkmate. I think that should work out. Okay, so the puzzle stops after we give the check, but okay, that was going to be the win here in this position. Okay, next position. Our opponent just moved their knight to the d6 square. They are checking us, so we have to move the king. In terms of available squares, we really only have two different options. We can go over to the f8 square, or we can go to the d7 square. Going to f8 doesn't really put any pressure on white. Going to d7 does attack both of the knights simultaneously. So I'm focusing on the d7 square. And I don't really see a great way for white to guard both knights at the same time. I think pretty much anything they do will take one of the two knights on with our next move. So I think that's the way we're going to go. King here, knight. One of the knights does move. We take the other knight. Okay, white is attacking our knight on c3 that's pinned. We need to figure out how we're going to react to this threat. We don't really have a way. Well, there is one move that does protect the knight. We do have the move pawn to d4 available. It looks like white would just go ahead and capture the pawn with their knight, giving a check towards our king. But I guess after that, we can play the move king to d5, attacking the knight on d4. And so if white takes our knight on c3, we take their knight on d4, and then we're still ahead. We're ahead an entire rook in that position. And if they don't take our knight and they move their knight away, then we can save our knight at that point since our knight would no longer be pinned, and then we're still going to be ahead of rook. So I think the focus of this one is not only winning the knight, but also how to save our own knight so that we're not allowing white to win back some of that material. I will point out here that you don't want to let white take this knight and not get anything in return, because even though we would be up the exchange in that position, we would have a rook versus a knight, we would also be down a pawn at the same time, and it's not the simplest win in the world, I would say. I'd say it would take a lot of work to win that endgame. But d4 is going to be the best move. Then king d5 to hit the knight. The knight takes on b5. Here we can take the knight. And even if white was to make the check, we would move the king away somewhere. They take the knight, but we're still up a full rook. And being up a full rook is clearly better than being up the exchange. I guess we would be down a few pawns, but a rook versus 2 or 3 pawns is better than a rook versus a knight in the pawn, for sure. Okay, next position. Black just played the move king to a6. What checks do we have available? We can check with the queen on b5. We can check with the queen on c4. We can check with the rook on a3. The king actually has no escape squares right now, and our queen is doing a good job of covering those escape squares, so I would be very cautious about giving a check that opens up an escape square. Like queen b5 check, the king gets an escape square. Queen c4, they get to trade queens. Rook a3 is looking very good because the king has no places it can move to. I think black would have to block with the queen, and then we can just take the queen, and that is going to be the checkmate. So yeah, if the queen has to block, we would take the queen. The puzzle stops here, but we do get the the win. We'd have checkmate on the next move here. Okay, black just played the move queen to f7. What checks and captures do we have available? We have 2 different checks. We have knight f6 check and queen takes queen. Knight f6 check, white just loses a piece. Black would take the knight with the pawn. So that doesn't look all that great. I don't really see a great follow-up there. Queen takes queen. King takes. It looks equal for the moment. But then we ask, do we have any follow-up checks? Do we have like a follow-up forcing move? And we actually do have an additional check after that. We can play knight to d6 check, hitting the king that's on f7, as well as attacking the bishop on c8. And wherever the king goes, we'll take the bishop. We'll be up a piece. That looks pretty good. So trade queens, check, take the bishop. we are ahead a piece in this position. All right, next one here. White just moved their king up to g5. What checks and captures do we have available? In terms of the king's safe squares, there's really only two of them. g5 that it's currently on, and then the h4 square. Every other square around the king is covered. Can we deliver a check that takes away these escape squares, or hits the king as well as covering an escape square? And it does end up that we have the move queen takes g3. Queen takes g3 hits the king, covers h4. The king has no escape squares otherwise, and queen takes g3 is just going to be a one-move checkmate in this position. Okay, here white just played the move bishop back to d3. We don't have any checks available. We really only have the one capture available. And otherwise, if we're not taking their bishop, we need to react to them taking our bishop. So this is one where, because it's a puzzle, you could easily have the feeling that I need to take the bishop. During a game, you wouldn't know that, let's put it that way. You could calculate and find out that maybe it's the best move, but during a puzzle, it's very easy to think that there's really no other moves that put any pressure on the opponent or force them to respond. So the answer must be bishop takes d3. Even if you had that thought, which is correct, I would say, bishop takes d3, as far as I'm aware, is the best move, you still would want to calculate it out. You don't want to just play the move and then figure it out later, I would say. Because in a game, if you had this position in a game and nobody told you there was a tactic, you wouldn't want to just take the bishop, then figure it out. You'd really want to figure it out before you took the bishop, because maybe taking the bishop isn't the best move in a game situation. But here it is going to be the best move. Taking the bishop, white takes back. What we need to create in that type of position is we need to create a passed pawn. And that's really what all king and pawn endgames are all about. If you can create a passed pawn and then eventually promote one of your pawns, you're going to win. If you can't do that, you're either going to draw or you're going to lose. So if we make the trade of bishops, we have to figure out how to kind of break through white's defenses. It's not going to happen on the king side where everything's symmetrical. It's usually going to happen on a side of the board where things are not symmetrical. And what we can do here is we can consider to push the c pawn, or we can consider to push the e pawn. We have to pick the right order, though, because if we push the c pawn first, the pawn on d3 can take you on c4, and then you actually don't really have a way to make progress. White doesn't want to take with the b3 pawn, because then our b pawn would run down the board. But if we pushed and they took with the d pawn, then we don't really have a whole lot we can do. What we can try to do first, though, before pushing the c pawn, is we can give up our e pawn to kind of pull away or divert the d3 pawn, and then we can play the move pawn to c4. And so this is a concept in king and pawn in games known as drawing a blank here. Breakthrough. Sorry, that's it. And it's a concept known as breakthrough in the end game, in these king and pawn games. You're using pawns, you're sacrificing some pawns in order to open up a pass pawn opportunity, and that's what we're going to do here. So we trade the bishops, we push the e pawn. If white doesn't take the pawn, we're just going to take their pawn. But if they had taken our pawn, we would have given up another pawn in order to get the b pawn to open up to become a pass pawn and work towards promotion. And the b pawn would also be very, very far away from the opponent's king. So in the game, or in the puzzle here, white didn't take the pawn, so we're going to take their pawn. And now we're just up a pawn. If the king starts to run over, we can also run up. So if they played king e1, you can run up. They move up, you move up. Black is going to win that endgame for sure. Okay, let's go to the next one. So here black just captured a pawn on e5. We want to figure out what checks and captures we have available. Bishop takes f7 is a check. Bishop e5 is a check. Don't really see any other checks that make any sense. Queen e6, you lose your queen to the pawn. So bishop takes f7 check. The king has to move up to the e7 square. And then the king has only two safe squares available. The e7 square it's currently on and the d6 square. We can deliver a check with queen to e6, which ends up being a checkmate because we hit the king and we cover d6. And our queen on e6 is protected by the bishop on f7. So check. And yeah, if the king moves up, queen to e6 would be checkmate, but the puzzle cuts off here. Okay, here black just moved the knight back to the g6 square. What checks and captures do we have available? In terms of checks, we really only have the sacrifice of the queen for the knight. And then I guess you could take back with the rook, but you're most likely not going to have enough firepower to do the damage because we would only have one rook. The opponent would have 2 rooks and 2 minor pieces, which is a very big disadvantage for us. So there's not really any checks that work. In terms of captures, we already saw that taking the knight's not working. The c5 pawn is protected, the d5 pawn's protected. It ends up, though, that the rook on d7 is not protected, because if we take the rook, the knight is not able to recapture, because our rook on b1 would be pinning the rook, or sorry, pinning the knight that's on the b6 square. So we can actually get away with grabbing the rook on d7, and then black's not able to recapture in this position here. Now, objectively, material-wise, it's actually relatively balanced. Black has 3 minor pieces versus the queen. The problem that black runs into, though, is that there's really no good way for them to stop queen to b7 checkmate next move. And so the puzzle ends here, but we would pretty much deliver checkmate on b7 in response to any move that black plays here. All right, next position. White just played the move bishop d6. They are attacking our rook on the b8 square. We don't really have any checks we can make in this position. And in terms of captures, we probably aren't going to capture the pawn on b4, since they'll either take our rook or they're going to take our rook. You know, if we take with the bishop on b4, they take our rook on b8. And if we take with the rook on b4, they take with the bishop and they take the rook on b4. So we can't really take the pawn. We can't deliver a check. So we have to see if we have any threats that we can make. Can we attack something that's undefended? Can we attack something of high value? It ends up that there's 2 undefended pieces kind of lined up together vertically. And if we play the move rook to d8, there's not really a great way, as far as I can tell, for white to save both pieces. So they could try their own counterattack, I will say. They could try some kind of rook d1 or rook c1 move themselves. But I think things will work out for us. First of all, if we go rook d8 and they go rook c1, we take a bishop, they get a bishop, we get a second bishop, and then we're up a piece. If we go rook d8 and they go rook d1, we take a bishop, they get a bishop, and then I think we can finally take the pawn on b4, because the bishop on d6 is pinned vertically there. So rook d8, in this case they went for rook c1. We take a bishop, we take a second bishop, we are up a piece with a winning advantage here. All right, next position. Black just played the move pawn to g6. So again, we always start with checks. There's pretty much only one check that makes any sense. That's rook h8. Rook f7, you would just lose the rook. Rook h8 check, the king has to go to g7. And then from there, the king has these 3 squares safe to, run away to. Can we deliver a check that hits the king and takes away the f7 and f8 squares? And that would be with the move queen to f8. That would deliver a checkmate in that position. So rook h8 check, then queen f8 with the checkmate. All right, so in this next one, it's white's move. Black just played the move rook to f8. What checks do we have? We can take the pawn on b7 2 different ways. We can take with our f7 rook or our b3 rook. It is going to be pretty important which rook we choose to take with, because it depends on which one gives us the best follow-up. If we take with the f7 rook and the king moves to the corner, which is the only safe square, our bishop does cover c8, do we have a follow-up check at that point? And we don't really have one if we use this rook. Rook a7 check, the king would take it, and rook b8 check, the rook would take it. If we use the other rook, which is the b3 rook, to give the check, once the king goes in the corner, now rook to a7 check is safe to play, because our rook on f7 is protecting that rook on a7. The king would go back to b8, then we could bring the other rook over to the b7 square, and that would actually be a checkmate, because the king is hit, it can't go to a8, because the rook covers that square, and it can't go to c8, because the bishop covers that square. So if we use the b3 rook, this is going to eventually deliver checkmate, king moves over, check again, and then finally bring the other rook to finish the game. All right, next one here. So here it is, our move is black. White just played the move queen to a1. What checks do we have available? We have the check with queen f3 check, and we have queen takes b3 check. I would lean towards the move, once again, that gives the opponent the least amount of responses first. So if we take on b3, white has 2 different squares they can move the king to, plus they could block with the queen, which wouldn't really be a good idea since we take it, but they have 2 king squares to move to. If we check on f3, the king only has 1 square available to move to. So that's the move I would first look at, just to simplify my calculation. So queen f3 check, king h4. Do we have any follow-up checks? We have queen f2 check, and we have g5. Queen f6 check won't work because the queen covers that square. So we have those two different checks that are available. If we go to f2, the king could go back to h3, and then I'm not really sure if we've made much progress there. Whereas if we check with g5, the king moves further up the board into our own territory, which is a bit risky for them to do. And so when the king is on h5, and now it has no available moves and no safe squares to go to, and then I think we can swing the queen over to h3 and deliver the checkmate there. So it does end up that we check here. Okay, the puzzle cuts off at this point, but if the king had moved up, check with the g-pawn, king continues moving up, and then queen to h3 would have been checkmate at that point. Okay, so we start off at 1,000. We're up to 1,201, so we got the next 200 points taken care of here. So hopefully you enjoy going through these puzzles. Hopefully I was trying to explain them pretty well. We are seeing a lot of, I would say a heavy focus on just like checks and captures in this rating range of puzzles. I started off, I think, at 400 at the beginning, and yeah, this from 400 up to 1,200, it's been a lot of checks and captures. There are some cases where we're making some threats. The puzzles will progressively get more difficult as the speedrun continues. But yeah, hopefully you enjoy these puzzles, and I will see you in the next video.